Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining me here on the I Am Barabbas podcast. My name is Reggie Thiel, and today we are looking at the Torah portion reading, which is titled Life of Sarah. The portion covers Genesis chapter 23, starting in verse 1 to Genesis chapter 25, verse 18. It also includes 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 1 through 31, and 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 50 through 57. Now, I know that we're a little bit late with this recording and with the posting on YouTube. Just been traveling and trying my best to get things done. Got back home today. It's Friday, November 29th. And so, yeah, I'm just trying to knock this video out so I could post tonight the next readings for next week's study. And then we will be looking to make a video for that at the normal time, like on Tuesday or Wednesday. So, I want to start by looking at these two passages in the Old Testament, or in the scriptures here in Genesis 23 and 1 Kings chapter 1, and also think about the title. So the title of this week's reading is Life of Sarah, but the reality is that this reading is about the life of Abraham and the life of David, and specifically how their lives end and how their lives can be seen as contradictions of each other, because both men walked in ways that were just different. They were different from each other, and so there's a lesson for us to learn from their walks and how they walked and how their lives ended, correlations between the two, and what we should want to look for in our own lives in terms of how we walk and how we would like our lives to end. So, as I mentioned at the end of last week's video, that I was speaking at the Ocala Bible Chapel on Sunday, which I did, and I spoke mainly on chapter 24 is where I focused my message, and I titled it Guideposts for the Way. And so, the central theme of my message on Sunday was identifying those landmarks or guideposts that let you know that you're walking the way of the Lord. And a guidepost or landmark, I think most of us can understand these concepts. The description I used in the message was just like you're traveling down a highway, and we use the Florida Turnpike, and you use mile marker signs to know exactly where you are or have an idea of where you are. Especially I've been driving up and down the Turnpike for years now. My mom moved to Ocala in 2003, so it's just like, knowing it, the highway in the back of my hand, I just know it really well. I know where construction's going on now. I know where it's different. I know where you can go a little faster. I know where you should slow down, that kind of thing. And so, when you're walking in this world, how do you know that you're walking the way that God wants you to walk, or walking in His way, the way of Adonai, the way of the Lord? We looked at Genesis chapter 18 with the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and God telling Abraham about what was going to happen. We look back in that passage, God says, I choose Abraham to walk the way of Adonai, and then to charge his sons and his household to do the same. And so Abraham is an example to us about how we can know we're walking in the way of Adonai. And we looked at his acts of righteousness and his caring for orphans, and his caring for like his nephew Lot, and his caring for the sojourner, the traveler, like the way he reached out, like he tried to take care of those men who were visiting in chapter 18, the way he went ahead and tried to prepare a feast for them and everything else. And then justice for the widow and the orphan, and so the way he treated his son and Hagar after Sarah didn't want them around anymore. What's really interesting at the beginning of this reading is the language says that Sarah dies. Sarah was 127 years old, and she died in Hebron, the land of Canaan, and Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then and so I was just like, man, where was he? And it seems like he was in that area where the well was that Hagar was able to discover when she thought she was going to die out in the wilderness, and then she named the God who sees me. and the place was named after her. And it seems like Abraham was there. And I remember this passage happens after she was expelled of Ishmael, and then you have the sacrifice of Isaac's story, and then you have this passage happen. And so I just wondered, there's no definitive proof or thought or whatever, but I just wondered if Abraham, because of all of that with Sarah, was kind of, I don't know, maybe he was, going to visit Ishmael, maybe he was out visiting his son, and she died, and so that's why he had to come and see her, or he had to come up to where she was, where she died, so that he could be with her. Just a thought, is interesting. And then you have this whole interaction between the sons of Heth, who were also known as the Hittites, I believe, or the Hivites. I forget exactly which group that is. And they're sitting in front of the city gate, and just like Lot would have been sitting at the city gate of Sodom when he was waiting for visitors to come. And so they're talking, and they're having this town meeting, and Abraham wants to buy a piece of land, and he deals with this guy Ephron. He is a Hittite, so he's a Hittite. They're Hittites. He says that he wants to buy a cave of his, and Ephron says, "Oh yeah, you can have the cave. You can also have the land around it." And at first, it kind of sounds like he's being very generous, but when you find out later at the end, like how much Abraham spent on the land, he spent like 400, shekels of silver and weight, or whatever. That was an exorbitant amount of money. And so what Ephron was actually doing, he wasn't being kind, like, oh, you need the field, or you need the cave, you can have the field too. He wanted to exploit the fact that Abraham wanted the cave and was trying to sell more along with the cave so that he could get as much money as possible, which is what happens. And that kind of greed and bargaining and just taking advantage of someone whose husband just died, wife just died, and now in a way he's a widow, right? As a male widow, it shows you the opposite in terms of walking the way of the righteous, walking the way of the Lord in righteousness. You see the opposite there, where someone would rather take advantage of someone in a situation where they need something, so that you can make a lot of money from them, right? So in a way, just taking advantage of a widow in that sense. And Abraham just goes ahead with the deal that he's getting. He doesn't fight too much about it. So you see there in verse 14, he gets the 400 shekels. And again, the language is like, oh, what's it to me? 400 shekels for the land. And that's not him being kind. Like, oh, you can just have it. It's only worth 400 shekels. It's him saying, oh, this thing it's worth 400 shekels, but how much could that really cost you, or cost could that really be expensive to you? Like, it's nothing. And so he knows Abraham's wealthy, and it's true that Abraham is wealthy, but it doesn't mean you could still take advantage of him. And so then Sarah is buried in that cave, and then Abraham, in the next chapter, it says that he's old and advanced in years, and this is the chapter that I focused on in my message on Sunday, and it's the passage where he's looking for a bride for Isaac. And in this passage, what you see is Eliezer. He's the head of the household for Abraham. He's the one that Abraham earlier, I think in chapter 15, maybe even 13, wanted to be the one that God would make the heir for this promise that he was given to bless the whole world, through his seed. And if you remember back in that, I think it was chapter 15, he said, he's like, what about Eliezer of Damascus? He could be great at this. And God said, no, it won't be him. It'll be someone directly from you. And then when Ishmael was born, he said, oh, let it be Ishmael. He says, no, it's going to be someone from you and Sarah. And then, eventually Isaac was born. So this Eliezer now is an older man. Remember in chapter 18, God said he picked Abraham because he knew Abraham would charge his sons and his household to keep his way. And so what he tells Eliezer is to find a bride for Isaac, but to not get one from the Canaanites. And the reason why is because he has seen in personal dealings, and the chapter before this is a perfect example of that. I think that's why it's listed this way. The story is told this way. It highlights for us that Abraham is well aware that the people of Canaan, the Canaanites or the Hivites or whatever, the Jebusites, all the ites that are there, going back to the table of nations, but the the people who live there, they do not walk in a righteous way. It's why he doesn't tell the truth when he goes to Egypt, exact truth about him, being married to Sarah, and also the Abimelech later. I mentioned that. He's not being so much afraid. I think he's being wise in his dealings with them, knowing that if he tells the complete truth, he'll be killed. And so he doesn't want that to happen because he knows they won't take care of the person who's sojourning, who's traveling like he would, like he's been taught, like he's been charged with himself. And so after living in Canaan, I think it's like 60 something years in total at this point, he's thinking, yeah, I don't trust them, and to have a bride from among them in the way, I just don't trust them to have a bride that would walk the way of righteousness and keep this way, so that my son can also keep that way. And there is kind of a theme. So there are those who, it's just kind of like the Deuteronomic, I'm saying right now, the Deuteronomy type message of don't marry foreign wives. There's a sense of like editing and maybe like pointing towards that kind of thinking and theology. And so definitely Ezra and Nehemiah preach that message post-exilic. They're like, don't marry foreign wives. Solomon did that. Don't do that. It leads to problems. And but it's not really just about marrying the foreign wives. It's about marrying into a family, which the people there in that family and the woman that you're marrying have not been raised in the same walk that you have been. And so there's then there's ability to pull a person away from their walk in that kind of union. There's always a give and take between both people. My wife and I both walk the same way, but in our personalities, in our home, we see similarities and differences now with each other that are really just the result of us living together and melding in experiences from how she was raised and experiences from how I was raised, and then like working on like, okay, what works, what is good, what is bad, what should be changed. And so we're kind of walking in a new way together as a family. And so what Abraham wants Eliezer to do is ensure that his son will walk the way of Adonai as he has raised him, and his mindset is find a bride for him that also walks this way. And so he tells him to go back to his homeland, the place where he came from. He wants him to find a bride from there. And so in this story, Eliezer makes the promise, and Abraham says, if nobody wants to come back with you, don't force them, just go. Which is important because at the end of the story, Rebecca agrees to go. She's not forced to go. So Eliezer goes there, and just notice how he prays here. And I want to make a couple points out of that. In verse 11, he makes his camels kneel outside the city by the well of water for drawing time. Then in verse 12 of chapter 24, he prays and he says, please make something happen before me today. Show loyalty to Abraham, my master. Look, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are going out to draw water. Now let it be that the young woman to whom I say, please tip your jar so that I may drink, will say, drink, and I'll also water your camels. Let her be the one you have appointed for your servant Isaac, so that I'll know that you have shown graciousness to my master. And again, he's looking for someone who walks the path of righteousness as he's been charged to do. And when you look at his prayer, what he's saying is, I'm going to ask for just a sip of water, and the please make it so that the girl I ask this to responds in a way that lets me know she's walking this righteous path. And how was he going to know? Because her response is, no, take more than just a sip. Drink until you're full. And then after he's done, to then offer to water his camels and to water them all the way. And so in his prayer, he's just identifying out loud what he recognizes as righteous walking. And so he wants God to make that clear to him so he could see it. And he's just praying in that fashion. It's not the same as some people, some people look at this passage and they talk about how, it's an example of how you can kind of direct God or use coincidence, I should say, to discern God's will. And so the example I used last Sunday in my message was, if you're driving or you're about to head out, today's Black Friday, you go out to the stores, you want to buy something, you can't afford this one thing, and maybe it's a new TV, a new iPhone, something, and you're saying to yourself, man, I really want this thing, but I can't afford it. Will God be okay if I did? And you really want to be convinced. And so you say, God, I really want this new item. So how about we do this as I go to Costco, or I go to Best Buy, or wherever it is that I'm shopping. If I get every red light, then I'm going to take it as a sign that you want me to buy this thing that I know I can't afford and I shouldn't get. And so that's what I mean by people. There are people who like to assign coincidences to events to try to say that that's the will of God in their lives. And so that's some proof that they can go ahead and do what it is that they want to do. It's not really how it works. That's not what he's doing, right? So if you've ever heard someone teach that kind of thing from this passage, it's completely in error. What's actually being said, and excuse the doorbells if that's being picked up, I don't know, somebody's ringing doorbell. But what is actually being taught is that there's a way to recognize those landmarks, those guideposts in someone's walk. And you can see those things, and you can, from certain actions, discern how a person is walking in the way of Adonai, and then you can then determine that this person does walk in righteousness. And so as the story progresses, Eliezer sees what he's looking for. He sees a woman who, Rebecca comes out. She's actually the first one that comes out. She offers him the drink after he just asked for a sip. And so he drinks until he's full, and then she offers to water the camels, and then she goes ahead and she's doing that. And the language just describes that this is taking time. She's running back and forth, and it's taking time, and he's watching her. That's what it says in verse 21. While the man continued to pay close attention to her, keeping silent in order to know whether or not Adonai has made his way successful. So he's really paying attention to the way that she's doing this act of service of kindness to him. That's really what it is, right? Kindness. And when he sees it, he brings out some gold and he offers that to her. And then he asks one final question to know, okay, does this person actually walk a path of righteousness, or is this just some kind of show? He says, is there room in your father's house? And her response is, yeah. She tells him who she is. She's Abraham's brother's granddaughter. Yeah, granddaughter. Nahor was Abraham's brother, and he had a son named Bethuel, and she is Milcah, and then so she's a granddaughter. And so Milcah was Nahor's wife. So he goes, Nahor was a brother of Abraham. Milcah was his wife. So Nahor's wife was Milcah. They had a son named Bethuel, and then Rebecca is their daughter. And so it's Nahor's granddaughter. And so she is of the family of Abraham. And so when the guy hears the offer, there's plenty of room. There's feed to give to your cattle. That's when he bows down and he worships God, and he realizes, wow, God really did set the way. He brought me exactly to the person I needed to be brought to. And I was able to now see and discern that they are righteous, that she's a righteous person. She is the right type of person for Isaac to marry. Remember, Abraham is doing this because he said, do not let him marry a Canaanite. And it has to be because he's lived 60-something years, 65 years, I think, by the time Isaac marries Rebecca at 40, where he has had time then to know what the people were like in Canaan, and to definitely determine he didn't want his son to marry one of their women because he was worried about the effect that she would have on his walk in righteousness. Now, the story takes a turn after this. Laban comes out. He's Rebecca's brother. And yes, the same Laban, if you're familiar with the story of Jacob, remember Rebecca is later going to have a son named Jacob. She's going to send Jacob back to this place to get himself a wife, and saying the same thing, like, I don't want you to marry a Canaanite, which Esau had already done. And so Jacob gets back here now, and then Laban in that story will be older. And what we know from that story is that Laban was a greedy guy. He manipulated Jacob into working 7 years to marry Rachel, but then he married, he gave him Leah, right? He deceived him, and then when Jacob found out, he was upset, and he told Jacob, "Listen, just wait one more week, finish the bridal week. I'll let you marry Rachel, but then after that, you got to marry me another 7 years." So in total, Jacob had to work 14 years to pay off like a debt to marry someone's daughter. So it tells us the kind of person he is, and in this story, we actually get a hint of that. Not a hint of it. I think it's pretty obvious when he sees the gold and everything that Eliezer has given to his sister Rebecca in this story in Genesis chapter 24. He's like very kind. He's like, "Oh, come on, in and come stay with us. Of course you'll stay with us." And then later, once he hears everything that the servant has to say about why he was sent there and how everything worked out and just all the signs that he saw, and how he saw Rebecca serving him and serving the camels and being kind in her actions towards him, and that was all confirmation that she's the right person for Isaac to marry. Laban, it says that in verse 50, Laban and Bethuel answered, and they said, and what that means is that Laban kind of jumps in front of his father and says, "Yeah, you can marry her." And so Bethuel agreed. He's Rebecca's father, but Laban was the first one to speak up, and so it kind of shows that he was impetuous, that he was impulsive, and he was crossing boundaries, and he was speaking out of turn. And so it again shows into his character. He sees the money and he wants the guy to come over. They hear the whole story. He wants the guy he's like, "Yeah, of course you can marry her." And it's because he wants to get more money out of this guy, which then they see, right? It follows. Servant brings out articles of silver and gold and garments and gave them to Rebecca, precious gifts to her brothers. And so Laban gets a little something, and to her mother. And then the brother and mother want him to stay. They want him to stay longer. He wants to leave. He wants to head back. After they spend the night together, he eats food and hangs out. He goes to sleep. He gets up. He's like, "Okay, time for me to go back with Rebecca." And they want him to stay. Why? Just seeing the pattern, strongly believe, and I said this on Sunday, they're trying to milk him. It's the brother, Laban, and the mother. I think they're trying to milk him for more wealth. And so they ask Rebecca, and here's the final sign that she walks a righteous path. She doesn't agree. She says, "I want to go." Right? It says in certain verse 56, "Don't delay me." That's him saying that, the master. And so they said, "We'll call the young woman and ask her opinion." And so what they, I think, are hoping is that Rebecca will say, "Yeah, I'd like to stay a little longer," knowing, okay, we're going to play the game and I'm going to help my brother and my mom and everyone else get some more wealth out of this guy before I leave. But Rebecca doesn't play along. She says in verse 58, when they ask her, "Will you go with this man?" And I could imagine, "So you're going to go with this guy now, or do you want to stay? I mean, he just got here, and my wife's pregnant, or this." Like, I could just imagine it's not just a simple question. It's like a lot of hinting going on. And Rebecca says, "I will go." I think she's done. She doesn't need to milk this guy anymore. She doesn't care to get more wealth for her brother or mother. She's ready to go and do the thing to meet Isaac and to marry him, which is what happened. So they send her off with her, it says her nanny, but there's someone who was with her since birth, which was kind of normal. And so off she goes. And then at the end of chapter 24, they marry with each other. And so that's where it tells us that Isaac brings her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and that he's consoled after losing his mother. Then chapter 25 ends with information about how Abraham had another wife, Keturah. Now some say that this is actually Hagar again, but the name is not repeated because of just sensitivities towards Sarah and like the afterlife, and thinking, okay, she probably wouldn't want everyone to know. I don't know if that's true or not. All I know is that he marries somebody else and he has more children with her, which then obviously tells us that Abraham is the father of many nations. Excuse me as I have some coffee here before I head out to play soccer tonight. So anyway, so the chapter ends about how long he lived. It says he lived 175 years. Please understand that the length of life, this many years now, early on in Genesis, everybody's living a long time, like 900 years for this guy, and 600 years for that guy, and 800 years for that guy, and whatever. It was just long life was normal. But not to live into the hundreds and past 100 and well past 100 is a sign that God has seen someone's life as being righteous and has blessed them with a long life. That's what that's supposed to signify. So with Sarah living to 127, if there's any apprehensions or wanting to judge her for what she did with Hagar and Ishmael and everything else, the fact that she died at 127 is actually kind of showing that God still approved of her life and her righteous walk. But perhaps there's also something to read in about how Abraham got like almost a full 50 years more than she did, right? That they didn't die together. But definitely the length of years is an indication in these writings about the righteousness of a person and how God rewards a righteous person with a long life. That's a lesson that comes out of the study of the scriptures in Moses' writings. And so then after his death, God blessed Isaac, and Isaac lived near Bir Laharoi. That's the name of that well that Hagar was at when she was desperate and God showed her a well. So it seems like Isaac settled there, and Ishmael tells us his lineages. And so what's really going on here as this chapter, or this reading, I should say, concludes, it just tells us that all of the descendants of Abraham from here on out are just tremendously blessed. So Abraham lives a long life, and all of his descendants are tremendously blessed with more children of their own, and time, and just, God has shown, and the writing shows that Abraham was truly a righteous person, and that he deserves to be remembered as such. Now, I mentioned that the reading also include 1 Kings chapter 1, and again, there's as I said earlier, when you look at the end of these two men's lives, Abraham and David, what you should see is that David's life, it was a mess. David's life was a mess. Now, when he first started out, surely he was described by 1 Samuel chapter 16, that I think it was that chapter, that he was a man after God's own heart. And a lot of people like to hold on to that statement and just say, well, that's who David was. But David lived up to that reputation for a while. The things changed the moment he had everything he could want. He was standing up at the top of his palace, and in pride he looks down, and that's really what the imagery is supposed to show us. He's walking on the top of his palace on the rooftops, looking down at everything below. All of his people, his men, everything else, they're out fighting wars and conquering and trying to claim the land of Israel as their own, finally as their own, and to chase out all their enemies. But he's there as the king, just standing up high, looking down at everything that he feels responsible for. And it's really a picture of pride, and he falls, right? And in doing that, he looks and he sees Bathsheba, and he calls her, or he goes, he summons her to the palace, and ultimately with his power, he's able to sleep with her and use her for his own purposes, which is the definition of rape. And so David's fall comes in that moment. And from that moment, when Nathan the prophet comes to speak to him, and he says, the sword will not depart from your home, it's just an indication to David, you really messed up. And now that you've messed up, the peace and all the protection and everything else that you've been enjoying, being labeled as the one that God loved, who had a heart like his own, that time is over. With all of your success and pride, you've now done the thing which is wicked and evil, and you're going to be judged for it, and your household will be judged for it. And that's why 1 Kings chapter 1 to verse 31 is offered as the complementary reading from the prophets to the Abraham passage. When I first read it, I was like, what does this passage have to do with with the end of Abraham's life. And then I figured it out when I compared the two, and it's like, oh, that's what it is. So in Abraham's end of his life, everything he's looking for is hit. All the all the results of his righteousness, all the promises because of his righteousness, that Isaac would be his heir, that he would, continue on. And so that means he would have to get married, and he would marry the right person. And then Abraham would also father many other children. He would have a long life, all of that. We just looked at all of that. And so it just shows us, it confirms for us the readings that Abraham truly was righteous. David's life is a mess at the end. And in this chapter, he's sick. He's old. At the beginning, they're like, oh, let's get a young girl to come sit in his lap and keep him warm. And so they do that. It doesn't really help. It says he wasn't intimate with her, so there's nothing going on with him. He has no ability. At the end of Abraham's life, he got married again. He's got another wife. He's having more children. So there's vitality in his life. For David, this young girl comes and he can't perform. He's really just he's done. His body is failing him. That's a significant sign and difference between the two. And then his son, Adoniah, which is like Lord and Yahweh combined, like Adoniah, he sees that his dad isn't doing so well, and his dad can't even get with this young girl and have sign of virility in life anymore. So he starts to say, hey, I'm going to name myself king, right? And that's, David just dealt with rebellion and Absalom and his failures there as well. He didn't protect his daughter Tamar, who was raped by her half brother, and Absalom, Tamar's full brother, kills Amnon and then starts a revolt because he knows his dad can't rule. He's not fit to rule. Then David has to flee again, which in the beginning he had to flee and he had to hide from Saul, but then that was supposed to be over as he did what was supposed to be righteous and not harm the Lord's anointed one. And he would cut the cloth, and he would even tease Saul, like, look, I was right there. I could have killed you. But then he would even feel bad about doing that. He goes from that to then his son rapes his daughter and doesn't do anything about it. Then his next son revolts, and it's all in line with his sin once he becomes king with Bathsheba and killing her husband and everything else. And so now, even though the rebellion's been squashed, and it seems like, okay, now we're at the end of his life, we can see that there's still no peace for him, because there was no walk in righteousness for such a long time after what he did with Bathsheba. There was just Nathan said, the sword won't depart from your home. And so Adoniah, he names himself king. He makes a big feast. He wants to exalt himself. He wants everybody to know, but he purposely doesn't invite Solomon. And he was a lot like Absalom, which is the writer's point to tell you, like, this is just like Absalom. This is like his brother. This is a kind of similar thing. And again, he's got to deal with this. And he gets together with Joab, and he gets with Abiathar, and they supported him. But Zadok, the priest, Benaiah, Nathan the prophet, Shimei, Ray, and David's mighty men were not on his side. So it shows again a divided household, no peace. Even with Abraham's death and everything that happened there with Sarah, Ishmael, we read that Ishmael and Isaac both come together when Abraham dies to bury their father and to bury him in the cave that Sarah was buried in. And I think where Isaac lives also shows that he was close to his brother. And so while he might have had this disconnect with Sarah, it shows that his family, his children, even though stepbrothers, just like David has these stepsons and stepdaughters, they get along with each other. They're working with each other. It seems like they have a positive relationship with each other. David's kids, all a mess, fighting with each other and claiming thrones and raping each other and killing each other. Just all kinds of stuff going on in this chapter really highlights that. And so this plan is put together by Nathan to put Solomon on the throne, and I'm not going to read it because it's just kind of a lot of words to describe this one story. And again, it ends in verse 31, so I'll leave it there. But this is basically what Nathan tells Bathsheba to do. He said, go talk to David and say, hey, didn't you promise that Solomon, my son, would be the king? And David's going to hear that and be like, oh, yeah, kind of, yeah, sure. And then Bathsheba's going to leave because they're going to tell him, Nathan's here to see you. And when Nathan comes in, he's going to say the same thing. Didn't you promise Solomon to be king? And so then David would hear it twice and think, oh, maybe I did promise that. Well, then call Bathsheba back in. And so he calls Bathsheba back in. He says, I'm going to fulfill it on this day, this promise I made to you. And so she worships, she's like, oh, let the Lord my king, David, live forever. The truth is, he never really made that promise to anybody. And so the end of his reign shows us that he is manipulated by others into doing something that they want him to do, and that's to name Solomon king. And so that's what ends up happening, and then that leads to, Solomon becomes a king, and just the story continues that he deals with Adoniah in a very harsh way, and has to deal with his son, his father's son, his stepbrother, harshly. And then later, Solomon's kingdom is also broken away from him with his own sin, chasing after foreign wives, even after building the temple. And so what these stories are supposed to show us is that on one side, you have a man who lived a righteous life. He had kids with different women, and he did that. His wife's idea with Hagar, talking about Abraham, and he had this kid, and then his wife died, and then he got married again, but he had more kids, but it just seemed like there was still peace together with that family, and he lived well and he lived long, and he still had virility to the end. David, on the other hand, is not full of that same kind of life. His family's a mess, and they are fighting with each other, and they're manipulating him into making decisions that benefit their sides and their factions, more like Game of Thrones, and where everybody's just out for themselves. And again, so the end of life for both of these men is completely different, and that shows you guideposts who's walking in the way of the Lord. And that's not to say that David doesn't go to heaven or is with God or whatever. That's God judges and God forgives, and that's what he counts faithfulness for. We talked about that a few weeks ago with faith being credited as righteousness, and how that is referring to God's ability to forgive sins and cover them with his love and to accept one into his presence. So that's not what I'm saying. What I'm focusing on is the idea of righteousness and living a righteous life in this world, and how we know we are walking the correct path. And I say all of that because there is a very clear message by Christians today that the most important thing is that you get saved and you go to heaven. I don't think that's the case. That's not the most important thing, that you just get saved and you go to heaven, you don't die and go to hell. I think the reason why we've been saved, the reason why God gives us righteousness credited as faith, is because he wants us to live righteous lives. He wants us to enter into covenant relationship with him, to know his way, and then to charge ourselves and our children after us, and anyone else who works with us and we are responsible for, to walk the same path, so that God's way is evident in this world. For Abraham, it wasn't evident. He was sojourning, he was traveling, and he could see that the world did not follow God's way, and he was the only one, and it was God's purpose and hope that through Abraham, he could bless everyone with the knowledge of what it means to walk in his way, to be kind, to be loving, to be patient, to be joyful, to have self-control, to be good, to be gentle. Okay? And then David, he doesn't stay on that path. He goes down a different path. He never fully repents from that, or it's just his life is just always a mess after his sin with Bathsheba. Sure, he says he's sorry, and he's fasting, he's mourning, he's crying, he's asking for his son to be delivered or not to die and everything else. But then what? What changes in his life? What becomes different? It's just one mess after another, all the way up until the end, where he's been being manipulated by others to do their will rather than him being the king that he's supposed to be. So let's say they're both in heaven. Okay, great. But what's the example that they set for themselves? What's the legacy they left for their families? Abraham's legacy is supposed to be one of he walked in faith and righteousness. And you think about Jacob and how he walked. And as each generation has more and more children, what you find as we go back to even the Genesis 1, there's always this kind of this one line that continues it on. For Abraham, he has Isaac, and Isaac has the two sons, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob's a rascal, and all this kind of stuff happens. But from Jacob comes the nation of Israel and the 12 tribes. And from those 12 tribes comes a man named Joseph, who's one of his sons. And he carries on that legacy of faithfulness to God and right behavior as he goes into Egypt and becomes king, or there's a second command to the king or Pharaoh. And so you can see that even though it's not everybody, there's still a preservation of the right way in generations after. With David, Solomon starts that way, and then it all explodes and blows up. And then it's like, well, where's the righteous line of David after that? The promise of a righteous line is one that's going to have to be fulfilled by God himself through his son, Yeshua, who saved us so that we could walk a righteous path. Like, what's it all for? What do we get saved for? What does Jesus die for and save us for and then leave us here on earth? A long time ago, an elder at the church in Gainesville passed away some years back named John Cease. He said to me, Reggie, what's the one thing that we can't do in heaven that we can do on earth? And so we were talking about, he's just kind of questioning me and quizzing me. And we concluded, like, you can worship in both places. You can praise God in both places. You can speak to God in both places. There's a lot of stuff you can do in both places. But one of the things you can't do is live a righteous life in a way that allows the unrighteous in the world to see the truth about the God that we serve. And so that ultimately has to be the reason why Jesus died for us, why the way was made, so that we can have a relationship, a covenantal relationship with God, which is based on faith, so that we can be credited righteousness and forgiven, and then empowered by the Spirit in a way that's unique and special after the death of Jesus and his resurrection, so that we can live an empowered life in the Spirit in which we show the nations in the world what it means to love God by loving our neighbor and loving each other. That's ultimately the point. And I think that's the ultimate ending for Abraham's life and for David's, and to show us those two differences. Just to take a look at it, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 50 through 57 was our New Testament passage, and it's the well-known passage that Paul talks about the miracle of resurrection, time changing. And so just the idea that death isn't the last thing for us. He says, now I can say this, brothers and sisters, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, right? The flesh and blood does not inherit the kingdom of God. And what decays cannot inherit what does not decay. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, the twinkling of an eye. At the last shofar, the trumpet, for the shofar will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we will be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruptibility, and this mortal must put on immortality. But when this corruptible will have put on incorruptibility, and this mortal will have put on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in a victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? Now the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the Torah, the law. But thanks be to God who keeps giving us the victory through our Lord Jesus, or Yeshua the Messiah. And that's really what how that ends. Is just kind of what I was saying, that yeah, if we're bound by the law, that's the power of sin. We're going to be forever owing God a debt for our sin, and owing him a debt in accordance with keeping the law. And that's why Jesus said he didn't come to abolish the law, but he came to fulfill it, so that we can then be set free from it and the burden of the law. Not the requirements of the law, but the sin burden of the law. The requirements of the law, which Jesus said or Paul said, and Jesus also confirms, can be summed up by one law: to love your neighbor as yourself. This is the burden of the law that we can now carry, because we have now been empowered by the Spirit. And yes, we will still die on earth. We can be righteous and live a long life, but ultimately we will die. And so the hope is that even when we die, that one day there will be a moment where all who have died will change forever into a thing that cannot be corrupted, a thing, a nature that's like the nature of God himself. And so that's the ultimate hope we have, and what drives us to say, okay, I am going to be obedient and I'm going to follow the way of the Lord because he has left me on earth to do so. I'm not going to follow my own way of pride and selfishness and backbiting and devouring and eating up other people for my own glory and for proclaiming myself better than others because they do things that I don't. That's pride. Instead, in humility, we walk. In love, we serve, and we share with others the love of our God by loving them as well. And by our love, that's how they will know that we belong to the God who created the heavens and the earth. By our love. That's inescapable. That's how righteousness can be seen in our life. So that will be the conclusion of the teaching for this week. Like I said earlier, it's Friday already. The sun is about to set. So in a few hours, I'll probably post the next set of readings. I hope that you get time to watch this and then get into the next readings soon. And it's not required to absolutely read it on Saturday. That's the practice, the habit of the Torah reading in the schedule is to read it and study it on the Sabbath, and then so that's why I would want to make the videos come out on Tuesday or Wednesday, so you have time to study it yourself, and then we can watch it. So I do apologize for the late posting of this particular video, but hey, what are you gonna do, right? Life comes at you. You gotta deal with what you deal with. But I'm thankful again for each of you that watch. And I just encourage you to like, subscribe, share with those that you think will like this kind of teaching. I know it's not for everybody, but for those of you that do enjoy it, it's just there's a connection there with God and with his teaching and the scriptures, or just wanting to know more about him in a deeper way. And so yeah, so if you know any other people that are like-minded the same way, go ahead, please share with them, and then reach out to me on social media. I'm on Threads. I'm on the YouTube channel. I'm on Instagram. I'm on TikTok. I recently got a Blue Sky profile, so I'm on that too. And I don't even know if I have any followers on there, but I'm going to start utilizing it to try to reach more more of an audience and that kind of thing. So yeah, reach out to me however you'd like for questions, comments, anything that you read that maybe I missed out I could maybe answer and share with others in the next video, because I'm sure others have similar questions. Okay, so that's it for this session. Thank you again for watching. Until next time, God bless.